All right, Karen, thank you for speaking with me today. Um, as I told you, we're looking into the National Library of Australia, and we wanted to get the perspective of an Australian, a potential customer of the library, and get your thoughts and feelings on some of the issues that we saw in reviewing the website and looking through their collections and some of the services they offer. Why do you think it is important for the NLA to address racial inequity, and particularly to recognize the past and present treatment of the Aboriginal people?
Well, thanks, Diane. It's actually a pleasure to be joining you today. As you know, Aboriginal equality and equity is one of my passion projects. I have a degree in community development, and I currently work in community services, so work with a lot of Aboriginal children and families. And what we always do now in Australia is when we first start a meeting, we do an acknowledgement to recognise the Aboriginal people who were the original custodians of this country. So I'll just start with that, if that's all right.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so our greeting, our acknowledgement usually goes, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. And for me, that's the Awabakal people. And I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any other Aboriginal people who may see this video or be present. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to this land, region, and nation.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so I did review your questions on the NLA, Diane, and I think they're doing a good job in trying to be inclusive to all Australians. But what we need to do is they need to recognise the very unique place that Aboriginal people hold in this nation and their culture. They do have an Indigenous collection that I've noted, but if they really want to be inclusive for all people, they need to ensure that the historical narrative is accurate and reflects all the perspectives of the peoples in Australia, that of the white peoples as well as the first inhabitants, the Aboriginal peoples. Basically, colonisation has left behind a pretty disastrous legacy, and which continues today. And it's critical that it's recognised and that we tell true stories and true histories about that, because we've got quite a shameful history of the way that Aboriginal people have been treated in Australia. I think the NLA needs to make their collections and information very accessible to everyone, and that they need to provide information in a wider variety of ways. So, you know, for example, with people with disability, we'd make sure they have accessibility physically or on the internet in order to, if they have low literacy or low vision. And we need to make sure Aboriginal people have the information available to them in ways that they understand.
Well, and you know, because this is the National Library of Australia, it's designed to serve all of the peoples, but it's located in Canberra, and I'm probably not pronouncing that quite correctly. But that means that for most of the country, they're only going to be able to access it online or through the internet. So as you say, it's so important for it to be accessible to everybody, to all potential customers there through online means.
Yeah, online means, and although we have to be mindful that a lot of people in Australia live in very rural or remote communities, and we don't always have access to internet, or it's hindered in some way, or even the knowledge and skills to access internet.
Right.
So, yeah, in the case of, say, Aboriginal people, they tell their history. It's more what we call a living history. So it's history is told in ways of stories and song, dance and art. So we need to ensure that not only, you know, white Australians, but also Aboriginal people, our First Nations, have access to the information in ways they understand. And also, yeah, so white Australia can start to understand the Aboriginal culture as well.
In Australia, is there any kind of trend to try to expand internet availability or accessibility across the country?
Well, we have a we do have something called the National Broadband Network, which has not very successful. But again, still in those more remote communities, we find that access to the internet is sporadic. It's not very good. Even having, say, access to the equipment,
Right.
to computers, those type of things, may be a barrier to all Australian citizens being able to access this information the NLA provides.
Well, and I think we've seen in the pandemic that with a lot of students learning at home and having at-home learning, that we've seen that there's a real divide, a real socioeconomic divide that a lot of times is along racial lines, regarding access to the internet, having decent laptops, or even a smartphone or a desktop that would allow the students to access the information that a lot of us take for granted.
Yeah, exactly. And with the Aboriginal communities, particularly in those remote and rural areas, you will find very much a lot of poverty, and having that access to this kind of equipment and information would be really difficult for many people.
Karen, you've mentioned before that how important you think it is Aboriginal reconciliation and recognition. And when you talk about that, what are you referring to?
So this would be my understanding. I'm a white Australian, so I can only speak from my perspective. I can't speak for Aboriginal people. But my understanding is recognition refers to recognising the Aboriginal people as our First Nation of Australia and the original custodians of the country. It's about recognising their rightful place, all of the contribution to the land, nation, and the fact that they are one of the most, if not the oldest continuing living culture in the world.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, over 60,000 years, Australian Aboriginal people have been living in this land.
Wow.
So it's pretty amazing when you look at it from that perspective. But we also need to recognise the effects colonisation had on that culture and on these people, and how the continuing legacy of the effects of colonisation have impacted Aboriginal people, creating them, causing them to be some of the most marginalised in Australia, socioeconomically, health-wise, in terms of incarceration, justice, all of those social determinants, health.
I was looking into this a little bit, and that was something that was pointed out, is that they still see longstanding or ongoing issues with health and healthcare availability for the Aboriginal people, and they still to this day suffer from many more health issues and poor health than the white Australians do.
Yeah, and again, that's tied to the socioeconomic sort of those social determinants that impact them due to being such a marginalised demographic in our culture.
And again, another thing I was looking at a little bit was finding some similarities between the colonization of Australia with the colonization of the United States. And again, the same marginalization and oppression of the Native peoples, whether the Native Australians or the Native Americans. And an issue you see historically is that it's the white colonizers that are oftentimes considered to be the folks that were actually oppressed because they were leaving Great Britain or whatever under difficult circumstances or to escape persecution. And this all becomes a sort of an excuse or justification for their, in some cases, literally wiping out a population that had been there for thousands of years.
Yeah, exactly. It's this sort of, as I referred to before, the whitewashing of history and making the colonizers out to be coming to such a hostile land, and the narrative has for many, many, many years been flipped to definitely privilege those voices and maybe not privilege the voices of those who have been colonized.
Right. Those that we should be listening to, I think. You know,
Yeah.
and another thing that I found a kind of a similarity there is that in both cases, there were policies of child removal, where the colonizers would go in and take children away from their homes, their families, their communities, and put them into oftentimes horrible boarding schools where they were abused and forced to basically give up and ignore their own heritage, and sort of embrace a white heritage instead. And unfortunately, that seems like that was common in both places, Australia and in America.
Yeah, and a lot of these children and young people that were removed basically went to these homes to be trained for either farm work or domestic servitude. So basically, it's kind of to be honest, it's our shameful slave history in Australia is removing these children. And it was a way of forced assimilation, which
Right.
is really genocide under, if you look at international law, like attempting to eradicate a group of people does come under the international definition of genocide. So it is often referred to as genocide.
And you're right. And it's not just the genocide of killing people, but the genocide of wiping out a culture and a history.
Absolutely.
You know, were you taught any of this in school? Sort of the history of the Aboriginals?
No, not at all. I went through school sort of in the 70s and 80s, and pretty much I got the whitewashed version of history. So it was that the British colonizers had come and civilized the native people and brought them all this wonderful European culture. We kind of, it was all skipped over the ugly parts, like the invasion of Australia that was occupied at the time. We skipped over the slaughter of the Aboriginal people. We skipped over dispossessing them of their land and spreading them to areas that weren't their traditional lands and where they were used to subsistence and getting their food and culture sources from. And then, you know, the forced assimilation of kids. So it was kind of a kill them out, move them out, and then breed them out effective approach to the Aboriginal problem as it was known at the time, which is appalling. So no, we were just taught the sort of white version, and also terra nullius, that the country was unoccupied, which was one of the three ways that the colonizers were able to come and take the land, was either as unoccupied, they needed to sign a treaty, or it needed to be through battle and winning the country. So the Brits decided to declare the land was terra nullius, or, you know, not empty to an effect, and take the land for their own. So even now, it's still contested that, and it's still seen that this is Aboriginal land that's been stolen. So we were kind of taught, you know, they were the primitive kind of culture, and they were so lucky that the Brits came and colonized and brought this lovely European culture, and given those type of narratives when I was at school. And still to this day, we're still discussing and sort of slowly including more of the Aboriginal perspective of history, but it's very slow. It's slow.
And looking from our perspective here, looking at the NLA, it looks like they're trying to address some of these issues in Australia's past. Do you think they're adequately addressing those issues, or what would you like to see them doing differently?
Look, I've had a look at the resources that the NLA has incorporating in their collections. It does have a good, I guess, a timeline of resources. Some of them are historical, some of them are more contemporary. But it seems a very small collection, especially considering the really broad history of Aboriginal Australia and the massive diversity of the culture. You know, there were over 300 language groups of in Aboriginal Australia.
That's amazing.
And yeah, 250 different social groupings. So, and each of those had their own language, culture, customs, country they were on. And so a collection here with such a limited array of resources is really only just kind of scratching the surface a little bit. I think they could do a little better.
And also, what are your thoughts on what they could do to for outreach? What kind of outreach do you think would be productive to reach out to the native Australians?
Yeah, look, that's really important because as you mentioned before, the NLA is in Canberra, which is our capital, but not everyone has the ability or the resources to be able to go and access that. So I think NLA needs to kind of reach out more to people. You know, my initial thoughts around this is that they have, you know, good accessibility through the website, but as we talked about, websites are not always accessible. So potentially reaching out, maybe in a mobile version of the library, taking it out, say on a road show to more regional or remote communities, potentially bringing in people to run different programs. You know, you can't be everywhere in Australia because it's actually a huge country. So bringing in people to run particular programs for people who'd like to learn more around history or ways of adding to the collection even, because we've got to be mindful that, you know, Aboriginal people's stories should be told by Aboriginal people.
Well, and that's what kind of going from there is, how can the NLE be more inclusive of the Aboriginal people, and whether you know or can tell, or how could they perhaps be mindful of hiring Aboriginal people, so that, as you say, when they've got representatives from the NLA that are going out into these communities or spreading these stories or sharing this history, do you have any thoughts on what they could do to be more inclusive of the Native Australians?
Well, yeah, obviously, if they're going to the communities, there needs to be a lot of engagement with the community prior to that, and conversations had with elders and, you know, the community leaders. Probably, you know, engaging members of the community to come along and tell their stories as well, which could be added, if they're comfortable, added to the collections. Engaging, you know, letting people know what's available through the NLA if they do want to, you know, kind of go and access that collection or add to it. And I kind of feel that the NLA, probably as Australian culture is such an integral part of our culture, they need a dedicated branch of the NLA that would deal with Aboriginal culture and history. Not just a simple collection, much as they've got, say, an Asian collection or a, you know, a this collection or whatever. It probably needs to be a dedicated branch of the library run by Aboriginal people who determine what goes into that collection, what's important, how do we get those stories, how do we get that, how do we make this accessible to Aboriginal people in other communities. And I also would like to see the term Indigenous changed. A lot of Aboriginal people feel the term Indigenous kind of refers to them a bit as, well, they used to be documented as fauna. So Aboriginal people in the 60s, up to the 60s, were documented as fauna. We have our Indigenous flora, we have our Indigenous fauna, which were our Aboriginal citizens. They weren't able to vote, they weren't seen as people. And this continued through the 60s, pretty much up till I was almost born. So probably the term Indigenous is not a great term for the NLA to be using. I'd probably recommend something along First Nations stories, Aboriginal communities, something that maybe the Aboriginal communities choose for themselves, maybe an Aboriginal word.
You know, thank you for bringing that up. And I wish I had mentioned that earlier, is, you know, from the outside looking in, it was unclear to me what is the proper way to refer to the Aboriginal people, as the Native Australians, as the Indigenous people. And you're right, this is something that should be a question that should be posed to them, and should be how they view themselves and what they would like to be referred to.
Yeah, I think that would be a good start. We often do use the term Indigenous. It's not offensive to most Aboriginal people in terms of referring to, say, something, say documents or something along those lines. But if we want to make it a real living thing,
Right.
then we probably need to, and accessible to everyone, we probably need to find out what the preferred language is and what they would like to see it called.
And Karen, one final question, and changing a little bit here, is one thing we noticed in looking at the NLA was that the collection seems to be lacking in a collection related to the LGBTQ community. And there does not seem to be much of the collection that's dedicated to that community and their contributions to Australia. Although it does seem like there's some acknowledgement that's beginning to happen. Do you have any thoughts on, whether the outlook in Australia is changing and that there's now more inclusion of the LGBTQ community, or why this is maybe sort of an ignored area of Australian history, at least from the NLA perspective?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you highlight there, Diane. I took a look through that, and you're right that we're very light on LGBTQI resources there, and yet the LGBT community in Australia is such a diverse and rich community that's made a lot of contributions to our culture. I'm thinking that in 2017 we had a referendum which legalized marriage equality. So it legalized the right for same-sex couples to be recognized under law as married. So I'm hoping that due to that change, that institutional change, that we're going to see some more societal change in acceptance. And hopefully NLA will start to include a greater collection telling the stories. We've got some great stories of our history. We do have one of the largest gay and lesbian Mardi Gras in the world in Sydney, which was hard fought for by the originals, the 76ers they're known as. And they, were arrested and beaten and suffered a lot in order to get this Mardi Gras off the ground and in order to bring the community into the mainstream Australia. So I think it's really key that their stories are told as well.
Thank you, Karen. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and your willingness to participate in this. We're here in America looking over there, and we've really enjoyed looking at the NLA, but we appreciate the perspective of an Australian and how they look at what the NLA is doing, what they're doing well and what they could be doing different. And I really appreciate you giving us your thoughts on this today.